everyone. I'd like to continue the previous story. I hope you'll keep enjoying it. In the meantime, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you. It was a fierce battle, hard fought on both sides. The Lydians were fresh and well equipped. The Persians were veterans of their recent civil war, tough and determined. The two armies clashed and the fighting raged all day. When night fell, neither side had won a clear victory. Both had taken heavy casualties. It was essentially a draw. He sat back down. Now, Croesus made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He decided to retreat back to Sardis for the winter, to rest and refit his army, to call up reinforcements from his allies. The campaigning season was ending, you see, and in those days, armies did not usually fight in winter. So Croesus sent messengers to his allies, Egypt and Babylon and Sparta, asking them to send troops for a spring campaign. Then he disbanded most of his own army, sending the soldiers home for the winter, keeping only a garrison at Sardis. Bahram shook his head slowly, but Cyrus was not like other kings. He did not follow the normal rules of warfare. When his scouts reported that Croesus had disbanded his army, Cyrus made a bold decision. He would pursue immediately, not giving Croesus time to recover or receive reinforcements. In the dead of winter, Cyrus marched his entire army across Anatolia, pushing his troops hard, gambling that speed would give him an advantage that would outweigh the hardships of winter campaigning. Croesus could not believe it when scouts brought word that the Persian army was approaching Sardis. Bahram said with grim satisfaction. He had thought he had months to prepare. Instead, he had only days. He frantically called up what troops he could, arming even townspeople and slaves. When Cyrus arrived and saw Sardis sitting on its hill, well fortified and defended, he knew a direct assault would be costly. But he had a weapon that Croesus did not fully appreciate. The old merchant smiled. Camels. The Persians had brought camels to carry supplies, and Cyrus had heard that horses hate and fear the smell of camels. So he ordered his cavalry to dismount and gave their horses to others. Then he mounted his cavalrymen on the camels and sent them to the front of his army. When the battle began and the Lydian cavalry charged, their horses caught the scent of the camels and went mad with fear. They refused to charge. They bucked and reared. They threw their riders. The famed Lydian cavalry, the pride of Croesus' army, was neutralized. Without their cavalry, Bahram continued, the Lydian army could not withstand the Persian assault. They were driven back into the city of Sardis, and Cyrus laid siege. Sardis sat on a steep hill with strong walls, and it had never been taken by storm. Croesus thought he was safe, that he could hold out until his allies arrived with reinforcements. But a Persian soldier, watching the walls carefully, noticed something. A Lydian defender dropped his helmet over the wall, then climbed down a steep rocky section to retrieve it, using hand and footholds that only he knew. That night, a small group of Persian soldiers climbed up the same route, found the wall unguarded at that point because everyone thought it was unclimbable, and opened a gate from the inside. The Persians poured in, Bahram said. Sardis fell. Croesus was captured. And now came another defining moment for Cyrus. Croesus was his enemy, the man who had attacked him. who had started this war. By the customs of the time, Cyrus could have executed him, enslaved him, paraded him in chains. But once again, Cyrus chose mercy. He spared Croesus' life. More than that, he kept Croesus at his court as an advisor, valuing the old king's wisdom and experience. Croesus, who had lost everything, was won over by this generosity. He became a loyal counselor to Cyrus, helping him understand Western ways and politics. The audience murmured approvingly. This was becoming a pattern with Cyrus, and a pattern they admired. With Lydia conquered, Bahram continued, Cyrus found himself ruling over the Greek city-states on the Aegean coast of Anatolia. Cities like Ephesus and Miletus, Priene and Colophon. These Greeks were fiercely independent, lovers of freedom, early experimenters with democracy. Cyrus could have tried to crush them, to impose Persian customs and Persian governors on them. But instead, he allowed them to keep their own governments, their own laws, their own way of life. He asked only that they accept Persian overlordship, pay reasonable tribute, and provide troops when called upon. Most of the Greek cities accepted these terms, finding Persian rule lighter than they had feared. But Cyrus was not yet finished, Bahram said, his voice rising with excitement. He turned his attention to the east, to the vast steppes of Central Asia, home to fierce nomadic peoples. For several years, from around 545 to 540 before Christ, Cyrus campaigned in the east. He conquered Bactria, a rich land of cities and farms in what is now northern Afghanistan. He subdued Sogdiana with its great city of Samarkand. He pushed his borders to the edges of India and to the Sir Darya River in the far north. He brought under Persian rule the peoples who controlled the eastern reaches of the Silk Road. Bahram spread his hands, and then, having secured his eastern and western flanks, Cyrus turned his attention to the greatest prize of all, Babylon. A hush fell over the audience. Babylon. The name itself carried weight, mystery, the echo of thousands of years of history. Babylon, Bahram said reverently, was ancient when the Persians were young. It was one of the greatest cities in the world, with massive walls so thick that 2 chariots could drive abreast on top of them. It had the hanging gardens counted among the wonders of the world. It had the great ziggurat, the tower that reached toward heaven. It was a center of learning and culture, of astronomy and mathematics, of law and literature. The Code of Hammurabi had been written there. The prophets of the Jews had lamented there during their exile. It was, in many ways, the crown jewel of Mesopotamian civilization. But by the time Cyrus turned his eyes southward, Bahram continued, Babylon was in trouble. Its king, Nabonidus, was a strange man, more interested in archaeology and antiquarian pursuits than in governing. He had spent years away from Babylon, living in an oasis in Arabia, pursuing his research into ancient gods and temples. He had left the governance of Babylon to his son Belshazzar, but Belshazzar was young and inexperienced. Worse, Nabonidus had offended the powerful priests of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, by trying to elevate the moon god Sin above Marduk. The priests were furious, the people were confused, and the empire was weakening. Cyrus saw his opportunity, Bahram said. In 539 before Christ, he marched his army toward Babylon. The Babylonian army met him, at a place called Opis on the Tigris River. It was a short, sharp battle. The Babylonians were defeated, their army scattered. Cyrus's general, a man named Ugbaru, who was governor of the Persian province of Gutium, advanced on Babylon itself. Bahram leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. Now, you might expect a great siege like that of Sardis. Babylon's walls were legendary after all, but something remarkable happened. The priests of Marduk, angry at Nabonidus for his religious policies, opened the gates. The city surrendered without a fight. Ugbaru's troops marched in peacefully, and Cyrus followed shortly after, entering Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. And what did Cyrus do with this prize? Bahram asked rhetorically. Did he loot the temples as Assyrian kings had done? Did he tear down the walls and enslave the population? No. He entered the city with respect. He made offerings at the temple of Marduk. He claimed that Marduk himself had chosen him to rule Babylon, to restore proper worship and good governance. He proclaimed himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate king of Babylon, chosen by the gods. The old merchant's eyes gleamed. And then he did something unprecedented. He issued a declaration inscribed on a clay cylinder that has come to be known as the Cyrus cylinder. In this declaration, he outlined his policies. He would restore the temples that had been neglected. He would allow peoples who had been forcibly relocated to return to their homelands. He would respect the customs and religions of all the peoples under his rule. He would govern with justice and mercy. It was in many ways the first declaration of human rights in history. Among those who benefited from this decree, Bahram said softly, were the Jews. They had been exiled to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier, forced to leave Jerusalem when their temple was destroyed. Cyrus allowed them to return home. He gave them funds to rebuild their temple. The prophet Isaiah called him the anointed of God, even though Cyrus was not a Jew, because he had freed them from bondage and allowed them to practice their religion freely. Bahram sat back, his face thoughtful. This was the pattern of Cyrus's conquests. Strength, yes. His army was powerful and well-led, but also wisdom and mercy. He understood that people would more readily accept his rule if he respected them, if he allowed them to keep their identities and their dignity. Lydians, Greeks, Babylonians, Jews all found Persian rule more tolerable than they had feared, often more tolerable than the rule of their own previous kings. By the year 539 before Christ, Bahram declared, Cyrus ruled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, and it was governed not through terror but through a sophisticated system of administration that allowed for local autonomy within an imperial framework. Cyrus organized his empire into provinces, each governed by a satrap, a provincial governor, Bahram explained. These satraps had considerable authority in their regions, but they answered to the king. Cyrus built roads to connect his empire, established a postal system for rapid communication, standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. He allowed subject peoples to keep their own laws and customs where these did not conflict with imperial policy. He collected reasonable taxes, not the crushing tribute that earlier empires had demanded. In short, he created a system that worked, that was stable and efficient, and by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably just. The old merchant smiled. Cyrus did not live to see his empire reach its ultimate extent. That would be left to his successors. But he had created something remarkable, something that would last. When he died, in 530 before Christ, fighting against a nomadic tribe far to the east, he left behind not just conquered territories, but a vision of how an empire could be ruled with wisdom. His son Cambyses would continue his work, and later, Darius would bring that work to its culmination, creating the administrative masterpiece that was the Achaemenid Persian Empire at its height. Bahram looked around at his audience, seeing the awe and admiration in their faces. Remember this about Cyrus. He was not just a conqueror. He was a builder, a unifier, a king who understood that true greatness comes not from how many you defeat, but from how you treat those you have defeated. The peoples of his empire did not rebel en masse. They did not long for his death. When he died, there was genuine mourning even among those he had conquered. That is the measure of a truly great king. The fire crackled, and someone stirred, breaking the spell. The young boy spoke up, his voice hesitant. "You said he died fighting nomads. How did that happen?" Bahram nodded gravely. That is a story we will tell in our next chapter. The story of how even the great Cyrus met his match against a woman warrior named Tamiris, queen of the Massagetæ. And we will speak of his son Cambyses, who would conquer Egypt and expand the empire even further before meeting his own mysterious end. But that must wait. For now, rest in the knowledge that Cyrus built well, built wisely, built something that would outlast him by centuries. The old merchant reached for his tea, found it cold again, and gestured for a refill. The audience settled back, some of them murmuring to each other about what they had heard, others simply sitting in contemplative silence. The storm raged on outside, but inside, warmed by fire and story, they had traveled back in time to walk beside kings and watch empires rise. And Bahram, watching them, smiled with the satisfaction of a storyteller who knows he has his audience in the palm of his hand. The night was still young, and there was so much more to tell. Bahram took a long sip of his freshly warmed tea and settled deeper into his cushions. The storm outside had reached a kind of steady roar, no longer intensifying but showing no signs of abating either. It would be a long night, but no one seemed to mind. The story had taken hold. "Now then," Bahram began, "let me tell you of Cyrus's final campaign and the son who would succeed him. In the year 530 before Christ, Cyrus was in his 70s, old by the standards of that age, but still vigorous and still ruling his vast empire with a steady hand. But trouble was brewing in the far northeast, beyond the Sirdaria River, in the lands of the nomadic peoples." He leaned forward. "The Massagetæ were a nomadic tribe, fierce warriors who lived on horseback, following their herds across the endless steppes. They were related to the Scythians, those fearsome horse archers who would later give even the Greeks nightmares. The Massagetae raided Persian territory, striking fast and disappearing back into the grasslands before retaliation could come. Cyrus decided this could not stand. He would lead one more campaign, one more conquest, to secure his empire's northern border once and for all. But the Massagetae had something that few of Cyrus's other enemies had possessed, Bahram said with a slight smile. A leader of remarkable courage and cunning, Tomyris was her name, queen of the Massagetae, and she was a widow ruling in the place of her dead husband. When Cyrus sent ambassadors offering marriage, claiming he wished to unite their peoples peacefully, Tomyris saw through the ruse. She knew he sought to conquer her lands through marriage rather than war, and she rejected him flatly. The woman in the audience who had spoken before leaned forward with interest. A woman warrior queen. Did she truly fight? Oh yes, Bahram confirmed. The nomadic peoples of the steppes did not always separate their men and women in the way that settled civilizations did. Women who could ride and shoot were valued. Tomyris was by all accounts a formidable leader, respected by her warriors. When Cyrus, rebuffed in his marriage offer, began his invasion, Tomyris sent him a message. She warned him to turn back, to be content with ruling his own vast empire and to leave her people alone. If he would not, she promised he would have all the blood he could drink. Cyrus did not listen, Bahram said sadly. Perhaps he had grown too confident after so many victories. Perhaps he believed no nomadic tribe could stand against his professional army. He crossed the Sirdaria River with a large force. Tomyris withdrew before him, using the steppe nomads' traditional tactics of retreat and harassment. But Cyrus had a plan. He left a small force behind at his camp, poorly defended with supplies of wine and food. Then he withdrew with his main army as if retreating. The young boy's eyes widened. A trap? Exactly, Bahram nodded. Tomyris' son, Spargapaises, was young and impetuous. He commanded a portion of the Massagetae army. When he saw the apparently abandoned Persian camp, he attacked and captured it easily. His warriors, who were not accustomed to wine, found the Persian supplies and began to drink. They had no tolerance for alcohol, and soon the entire force was drunk and helpless. Then Cyrus returned with his main army and slaughtered them almost to a man. Spargapaises himself was captured. When Tomyris learned that her son had been captured through trickery, Bahram continued, his voice growing somber, she was enraged. She sent another message to Cyrus, offering to exchange prisoners and withdraw if he would leave her lands. But before Cyrus could respond, Spargapaises, sobering up and realizing the disaster he had brought on his people, asked his guards to remove his bonds for a moment. When they did, he killed himself, unable to bear the shame. The audience made sounds of sympathy and shock. Bahram nodded gravely. Now, Tomyris had lost her son, and her grief turned to fury. She gathered her full army, every warrior the Massagetae could muster, and she sought out Cyrus. The two armies met in a battle that ancient writers described as the fiercest fought in their time. The Massagetae fought with desperate courage, determined to avenge their prince. The Persians fought with the discipline and skill that had won them an empire. For a long time, neither side could gain the advantage. But in the end, Bahram said quietly, the Massagetei prevailed. The Persian army was destroyed. Cyrus himself fell in the fighting. The great king who had conquered half the world brought down by nomad arrows on a distant battlefield. Tomyris found his body among the dead. Some say she had his head cut off and placed in a skin full of blood, fulfilling her promise that he would have all the blood he could drink. Whether this is true or merely a legend, I cannot say. But Cyrus the Great died there, far from his beloved Pasargadae, his life ending not in his garden palace, but on the bloody grass of the steppes. A heavy silence fell over the audience. After a moment, Bahram continued in a lighter tone. But the empire Cyrus built did not die with him. It passed to his son, Cambyses, who had been left in Babylon as regent while Cyrus campaigned in the north. Cambyses had his father's body brought back to Persia with all honor and buried in the tomb that had been prepared at Pasargadae. It was a simple tomb, not grand like later Persian monuments, but dignified, and on it was inscribed a message that Cyrus himself had written. "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not therefore begrudge me this bit of earth that covers my body." Bahram smiled slightly. Simple words, but they capture something of Cyrus's character. Even in death he was humble, asking only for the small plot of earth that held his remains. Cambyses honored his father's memory by ruling as Cyrus had taught him, at least at first. Cambyses had been well prepared for kingship, Bahram explained. He had governed Babylon in his father's absence, learning administration and diplomacy. He was not as naturally gifted as Cyrus, perhaps, not as charismatic or wise, but he was capable and determined. He looked at his father's empire and saw one glaring absence: Egypt. The old merchant spread his hands. Egypt was the last of the great ancient powers that remained independent. Babylonia had fallen to Cyrus. Lydia had fallen. Media had been absorbed. But Egypt, ancient Egypt with its thousands of years of history, its pyramids and temples, its wealth and learning, still stood free. It was ruled by the 26th dynasty, by Pharaoh Ahmose II, who had allied himself with the Greeks and built a strong army. Cambyses spent 3 years preparing for the Egyptian campaign, Bahram said. He gathered supplies, built a fleet, made alliances with Arab tribes who could guide his army through the desert. He secured his northern borders, making sure there would be no rebellions while he was away. And in 525 before Christ, he was ready. He marched south with a huge army, Persians and Medes, subject peoples from across the empire, Greek mercenaries, ships sailing along the coast to supply the land forces. The two armies met at Pelusium, Bahram continued, near the mouth of the Nile. It was a hard-fought battle. The Egyptians were defending their homeland, and they fought with desperate courage. But Cambyses had the advantage in numbers and in the quality of his troops. The Persian army was by now a well-oiled machine, veterans of decades of campaigns. They broke the Egyptian line. Ahmose's son and successor, Psamtik III, who had only just come to the throne, fled south to Memphis. Cambyses pursued, Bahram said. Memphis fell after a brief siege. Psamtik was captured and at first treated well, as Cyrus would have done. But when he was caught plotting rebellion, Cambyses had him executed. Egypt became a Persian province. The 26th dynasty ended and Cambyses declared himself pharaoh, adding Egyptian titles to his Persian ones. With Egypt conquered, Bahram explained, the Persian Empire reached its greatest geographical extent. From the Indus River to Libya, from the Caucasus Mountains to the cataracts of the Nile, Cyrus and Cambyses had created a realm larger than any that had come before. It encompassed dozens of different peoples, hundreds of cities, every major center of ancient civilization except for Greece and India. The old merchant's expression grew troubled, but something went wrong with Cambyses in Egypt. The ancient sources tell strange stories. They say he grew cruel and erratic, that he kicked his pregnant wife to death in a rage, that he had his brother Badia murdered on suspicion of plotting against him, that he wounded the sacred Apis bull of Memphis, committing a terrible sacrilege in Egyptian eyes. How much of this is true and how much is propaganda from his enemies, we cannot be certain. But something happened to change Cambyses from a capable king into a troubled one. Perhaps it was the isolation of ruling such a vast empire, Bahram mused. Perhaps it was the pressure of living up to his father's legacy. Perhaps he simply had a darker nature that came out under the stress of kingship. Whatever the cause, Cambyses' reign ended strangely. In 522 before Christ, while he was still in Egypt, word came that his brother Badia had appeared in Persia, claiming the throne. But Badia was supposed to be dead, secretly executed on Cambyses' orders. Was it really Badia? Bahram asked rhetorically. Or was it an impostor, a man named Gaumata who looked like Badia and pretended to be him? The sources disagree. But whoever he was, this man seized power in the Persian heartland, declaring himself king and winning support by reducing taxes and freeing people from military service. Cambyses immediately marched back toward Persia to deal with this usurper, Bahram said, but he never made it home. In Syria, under mysterious circumstances, he died. Some sources say he accidentally wounded himself with his own sword, and the wound became infected. Others hint at suicide. Still others suggest murder. We will never know for certain. But Cambyses, who had added Egypt to his father's empire, died without heir, without even making it back to Persia, and his throne was in the hands of a man who might be his brother or might be an impostor. Bahram leaned back. The empire Cyrus built seemed on the verge of collapse. The king was dead. A usurper or pretender sat on the throne. The subject peoples began to stir, sensing weakness. It seemed that the great Persian Empire might fragment as quickly as it had been built, might go the way of so many empires before it, brilliant but brief. But then, Bahram said, his eyes gleaming, a group of 7 Persian nobles decided to act. They would overthrow the false king, whoever he really was, and restore legitimate rule. Among these 7 was a young man of the royal line, a grandson of Arsames, descended from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid family. His name was Darius, and he would prove to be the greatest administrator in Persian history, the man who would take what Cyrus and Cambyses had conquered and turn it into a true empire, organized and efficient and magnificent. The audience stirred with interest. This story was taking an unexpected turn. moving from the simple narrative of conquest to something more complex, more political. But that story, Bahram said with a smile, requires its own telling. Darius deserves more than a few words at the end of another king's tale, so let us pause here at this moment of crisis. With the empire teetering on the edge of chaos, when we resume, I will tell you how Darius seized power, how he crushed rebellions throughout the empire, how he organized and reformed and built until he had created something that would last for centuries. How he built Persepolis, the most magnificent palace complex the ancient world had ever seen. How he pushed the empire's borders even further into Europe itself. And how he met his match when he tried to conquer the stubborn Greeks. The old merchant stretched, his joints popping audibly. Several members of the audience did the same, grateful for the chance to move. The caravanserai keeper moved among them, offering more tea, more food, stoking the fire higher. Outside, the storm continued its fury, but no one paid it much mind anymore. They were too caught up in the story, in this tale of kings and empires, of conquest and administration, of the rise of Persia to heights undreamed of. And Bahram, watching them with satisfaction, prepared himself for the next chapter, the story of Darius, the great organizer, the builder of Persepolis, the king who would make the Persian Empire truly imperial. After another brief pause, during which the travelers helped themselves to the last of the evening's food, and the caravanserai keeper brought out fresh supplies of flatbread and dates, Bahram settled back into his storytelling position. His voice, which had grown slightly hoarse from so much talking, seemed to gain new strength as he began the tale of Darius. Now we come to one of the most remarkable figures in all of Persian history, Bahram began, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Darius, who would be called the Great, though his greatness was of a different sort than Cyrus. Where Cyrus was the conqueror with a kind heart, and Cambyses the warrior who expanded the empire, Darius would be the organizer, the administrator, the builder. He would take the vast conquests of his predecessors and forge them into a true empire, unified and efficient and magnificent. He leaned forward. But first, Darius had to seize power, and that is a story in itself. After Cambyses died in Syria, the man who claimed to be Bardia ruled from the palace at Susa. For 7 months, he sat on the throne, and in that time, he made himself popular. He reduced taxes dramatically. He freed people from military service. He showed favor to subject peoples who had chafed under Persian rule. Many in the empire rejoiced, thinking a new era of lighter rule had begun. But 7 Persian nobles were suspicious, Bahram continued. These were men of the highest rank, members of great families, and they believed the king was not Bardia at all, but an impostor, a Magus priest named Gaumata, who resembled Bardia and had seized power in the chaos following Cambyses' death. Whether they were right or whether they were simply ambitious men seeking power, we cannot be entirely certain, but they decided to act. The young boy spoke up. 7 nobles? Why 7? A good question. Bahram smiled. 7 was a sacred number to the Persians, associated with the 7 planets known at that time, with the 7 Amesha Spentas, or holy immortals, who served Ahura Mazda. These 7 conspirators saw themselves as instruments of divine will, restoring proper order to the empire. Their names deserve to be remembered: Otanes, Interfernes, Gobrias, Hydanes, Megabyzus, Aspathines, and Darius, son of Hystaspes. Darius was the youngest of the 7, Bahram explained, but he came from impeccable lineage. He was descended from Achaemenes himself, the founder of the dynasty, though from a collateral branch. His father Hystaspes was satrap of Parthia and Hyrcania. Darius had served in Cambyses' Egyptian campaign and distinguished himself. He was intelligent, capable, and ambitious. The other 6 conspirators respected him, though none of them could have known then that he would become the most famous of them all. The old merchant took a sip of tea, then continued. The 7 plotted carefully. They knew the palace guards were loyal to the king, whoever he was. They knew they would have to strike quickly and decisively. On a night in September of 522 before Christ, they made their move. They talked their way into the palace, claiming urgent business with the king. They fought their way through the guards who tried to stop them, and they cornered the man they believed to be Gaumata in the inner chambers of the palace. What happened next is described in the Behistun inscription, Bahram said, a massive rock carving that Darius would later have made to commemorate his deeds. According to this account, the pretender tried to flee, but was cornered in a small chamber. There, the 7 killed him, stabbing him to death. When the palace guards saw the body and heard the accusations that this had been a false king, many of them laid down their weapons. The conspirators had won. But now they faced a question, Bahram said with a slight smile. 7 conspirators, 1 throne. Who would be king? According to the Greek historian Herodotus, they made an agreement. They would mount their horses at dawn the next day, and whoever's horse neighed first would be king. It sounds like a story perhaps too neat to be entirely true. But Herodotus claims that Darius had a clever groom who ensured his master's horse would neigh by exposing it to a mare in heat the night before, then bringing the horse to that same spot at dawn. Whether this is true or merely a tale to explain how the youngest conspirator became king, we cannot say. But Darius became king, and the other 6 accepted it. Darius was not yet 30 years old, Bahram continued, and he had just seized the throne of the largest empire in the world through what was essentially a coup. Now he had to hold on to it, and that would prove to be the greatest challenge of his life, because the empire, sensing weakness, erupted in rebellion. The old merchant stood up, gesturing dramatically. Imagine it. From one end of the empire to the other, subject peoples rose up. In Babylon, a man claiming to be Nebuchadnezzar, descendant of the great Babylonian kings, declared independence. In Persia itself, rivals to Darius claimed the throne. In Media, an army rallied around a pretender claiming to be a descendant of Cyaxares. In Armenia, in Parthia, in Margiana, in Satagidia, in Scythia, in Egypt, rebellions broke out. It seemed the empire would tear itself apart. Darius faced 19 separate battles in a single year, Bahram said, his voice ringing with admiration. 19 battles against 9 different pretenders and rebel leaders. He could not be everywhere at once, so he divided his forces, sending trusted generals to deal with some rebellions, while he personally led campaigns against others. He marched thousands of miles from Babylon to Media to the far eastern provinces and back again. He was ruthless with pretenders but showed mercy to ordinary rebels who laid down their arms. The audience listened intently as Bahram described the campaigns. In Babylon, the false Nebuchadnezzar gathered a large army, but Darius defeated him in 2 battles and captured the city. The pretender was impaled, a terrible death meant as a warning to others. In Media, the rebel leader Phraortes tried to use the terrain to his advantage, but Darius hunted him down and defeated him in battle. In Persia itself, rivals were crushed. One by one, the rebellions were suppressed. By the end of 521 before Christ, Bahram said, Darius had won. The empire was intact, the rebellions crushed, his rule secure. He had proven himself to be not just a successful conspirator, but a capable military commander and a determined ruler. But more importantly, he had learned a valuable lesson. The empire was too large, too diverse to be held together through military might alone. It needed organization, structure, systems that would function even when the king could not be present. Darius set about creating those systems. Bahram settled back onto his cushions. First, Darius addressed the question of legitimacy. He had seized power through a coup, killing the previous king. Many in the empire doubted his right to rule. So Darius commissioned the Behistun inscription, carved high on a cliff face in Media, written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, so that it could be read throughout the empire. In this inscription, he told his version of events, how Gaumata the Magos had falsely claimed to be Bardia, how the 7 nobles had killed the pretender and restored proper rule, how Darius, by the will of Ahura Mazda, had been chosen to be king, how he had crushed all rebellions and brought order to the empire. Whether every word of this inscription is true, we cannot be certain, Bahram admitted. History is written by the victors, after all. But the inscription served its purpose. It established Darius's legitimacy. It warned potential rebels of the consequences of defying him, and it proclaimed his piety and devotion to the gods. Copies of the inscription were sent throughout the empire, translated into local languages, read aloud in public squares. Everyone would know that Darius ruled by divine right. But Darius did not rely on propaganda alone, Bahram continued, his voice warming with enthusiasm. He set about reorganizing the entire empire, creating administrative structures that would last for centuries. He divided the empire into 20 satrapies, provinces of manageable size, each governed by a satrap who answered directly to the king. Some of these satrapies corresponded to old kingdoms: Media, Lydia, Babylon, Egypt. Others were newly created, grouping together smaller regions. Each satrap had considerable power, Bahram explained. He collected taxes, maintained order, commanded the provincial military forces, dispensed justice. In many ways, a satrap was like a king in his own province. But Darius was wise enough to build in checks and balances. Alongside each satrap was a military commander who answered independently to the king. and traveling throughout the empire were the king's eyes and ears, inspectors who reported directly to Darius on the conduct of the satraps and the state of the provinces. A satrap who grew too independent, who abused his power, who failed to send the proper taxes, would soon find himself replaced, or worse. The merchant in the audience who had asked about written laws earlier leaned forward. "And what of taxes? You mentioned he standardized them?" "Indeed." Bahram nodded approvingly at the question. Under Cyrus and Cambyses, taxation had been somewhat haphazard, based on old systems inherited from conquered kingdoms. Darius regularized it. Each satrapy was assessed a fixed annual tribute, calculated based on the wealth and productivity of the region. Some paid in gold, others in silver, still others in goods. India, for instance, paid in gold dust. Babylon paid enormous amounts of silver. Egypt paid grain to feed the armies. The system was efficient and, by ancient standards, relatively fair. Darius also standardized currency, Bahram continued. Following the example of the Lydians, he issued coins throughout the empire. The gold daric and the silver siklos, named after Darius himself. These coins had the image of the king on one side, shown as an archer, emphasizing his military might. They had a fixed weight and purity guaranteed by the royal seal. Merchants could use these coins throughout the empire, knowing they would be accepted everywhere at the same value. This greatly facilitated trade. And speaking of trade, Bahram said, his eyes gleaming, Darius was a great builder of infrastructure. He expanded and improved the royal road, which ran from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, a distance of over 1,500 miles. This road had regular stations every 15 miles or so where royal messengers could change horses. A message could travel from Sardis to Susa in just 7 days, a journey that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months. The Greeks marveled at this postal system, and indeed, it would inspire similar systems in later empires. The old merchant spread his hands. Darius also improved harbors, built canals, established marketplaces. He even attempted to dig a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, though it was not completed in his lifetime. His goal was to make the empire unified, not just politically, but economically, to encourage trade and communication, to bind distant provinces together through roads and ships and the flow of goods and ideas. But perhaps Darius's greatest legacy, Bahram said softly, was Persepolis. In 518 before Christ, Darius chose a site in the heartland of Persis, on a natural terrace at the foot of the mountains, and there he began to build a palace complex that would be the ceremonial capital of the empire. Persepolis, the city of the Persians, would be his monument to Persian greatness. Work on Persepolis would continue throughout Darius' reign and beyond, Bahram explained. But even in his lifetime, it was magnificent. Picture it, my friends. A massive stone terrace built level against the mountainside, approached by a grand double staircase wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast. At the top, the gate of all nations, a huge entrance hall with towering columns and monumental sculptures of winged bulls with human heads, guardians of the palace. Beyond that, the Apadana, the great audience hall with a roof supported by 72 columns, each 60 feet high, the columns topped with capitals shaped like double-headed bulls and lions, uniquely Persian in style. Bahram's voice filled with wonder as he described it. The walls were covered with reliefs showing tribute bearers from all parts of the empire. Medes and Elamites, Babylonians and Egyptians, Indians and Greeks, all bringing gifts to the great king. Lions and bulls, symbols of power and fertility. The king himself, seated on his throne, receiving homage. Royal guards in their finest armor, the immortals, so called because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. If one fell, another immediately took his place, so the unit was, in effect, immortal. The palace was made of the finest materials, Bahram continued. Cedar wood from Lebanon for the beams, gold and silver decoration, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from Persia itself, ivory from India and Africa, glass from Egypt. It was a display of the empire's wealth and diversity, a statement that Darius ruled the world and all its riches flowed to him. But Persepolis was not just a symbol, Bahram said. It was functional. Every year, during the festival of Nowruz, the Persian New Year at the spring equinox, representatives from all the satrapies would gather at Persepolis. They would bring tribute, yes, but also reports on their provinces, petitions for the king's consideration, disputes to be settled. Darius would receive them in the Apadana, seated on his throne, surrounded by his courtiers and guards. He would hear their concerns, issue decrees, bestow honors. It was a way of physically manifesting the unity of the empire, of reminding everyone that all roads led to the Persian king. The old merchant smiled. The festival of Nowruz was a joyous time. There would be feasting and gift-giving, music and dancing, sacrifices to Ahura Mazda thanking him for the return of spring. The palace would be decorated with flowers. The gardens of Persepolis were renowned throughout the ancient world. The Persians had a word, paridida, meaning an enclosed park or garden, from which we get our word paradise. These gardens had pools and fountains, trees and flowers from every part of the empire, pavilions where the king could sit in shade and enjoy the beauty. For the Persians, a garden was a piece of heaven on earth, a place of order and beauty carved out of chaos. Bahram paused, his expression becoming more serious. But Darius was not content simply to organize and build. He was also a conqueror in his own right, driven to expand the empire further, to prove himself worthy of his great predecessors. He looked to the north and the west, to new lands to add to his realm, and it was in pursuing these conquests that he would meet challenges that even his organizational genius could not entirely overcome. But that part of the story, Bahram said, must wait for our next chapter. For now, remember this. Darius took an empire that was on the verge of collapse and forged it into the most powerful, most efficient state the ancient world had ever seen. He created systems that would last for centuries. He built monuments that still stand today, testaments to Persian greatness. He was not as charismatic as Cyrus, perhaps, not as personally appealing, but in his own way, he was just as great. Cyrus conquered, Darius organized. Both were necessary. Both made the Persian Empire what it was. The audience murmured their appreciation. Even those who had known little of Persian history before tonight could appreciate the magnitude of what Darius had accomplished. To take an empire and make it function, to create order from chaos, to build systems that would outlast the builder. This was a different kind of greatness, but greatness nonetheless. Bahram looked around at his audience, seeing their interest and approval, and allowed himself a satisfied smile. The night wore on. The storm continued outside, but inside warmed by fire and story and the sense of participating in something special. The travelers of many nations sat together, united in their fascination with the tale of ancient Persia. And there was more to come, much more. Bahram stretched his arms and rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness that came from sitting in one position for so long. The caravanserai keeper, attentive as always, brought him fresh tea and a plate of dates and nuts. The old merchant smiled his thanks and took a moment to refresh himself before continuing. "Now," Bahram began, his voice taking on a note of anticipation, "let us speak of Darius the Conqueror, for he was not content merely to organize what others had won. He had his own ambitions, his own dreams of expansion. He looked to the north, beyond the Danube River, to the lands of the Scythians, and he looked to the west, to the Greek city-states that sat on the doorstep of his empire." He leaned forward. "In 513 before Christ, Darius launched an expedition against the Scythians. These were nomadic peoples, much like the Massagetai who had killed Cyrus, fierce horse archers who lived on the steppes north of the Black Sea. They had been raiding Persian territory, and Darius decided to punish them and perhaps to add their lands to his empire. He gathered a huge army, said by some ancient sources to number 700,000 men, though this is surely an exaggeration. Still, it was a vast force, the flower of the Persian military. Darius marched his army to the Bosphorus," Bahram continued, "that narrow strait that separates Asia from Europe. There, Greek engineers in his service built a bridge of boats, and the Persian army crossed from one continent to another. It was a remarkable feat of engineering, and it showed the world that the great king's reach could extend anywhere. The army marched through Thrace, subjugating the tribes there, and crossed the Danube River on another bridge of boats. And then they plunged into the endless grasslands of Scythia." The young boy looked worried. "But didn't the Scythians use the same tactics as the Massagetai, retreating and harassing?" "Exactly so," Bahram nodded approvingly. "You are learning to think like a strategist. The Scythians refused to give battle. They retreated before the Persian army, driving their herds with them, burning the grasslands behind them, so there would be no fodder for Persian horses. They poisoned the wells. They sent small raiding parties to harass the Persian camp at night, to pick off stragglers, to wear down the enemy through 1,000 small cuts rather than one great battle. Darius chased them deeper and deeper into Scythia," Bahram said, his voice conveying the frustration the ancient king must have felt. "Weeks turned into months. The Persian army marched hundreds of miles into the steppes, finding nothing but emptiness and the occasional abandoned camp. Supply lines grew dangerously stretched. The troops grew weary and dispirited. Still, the Scythians would not fight. Finally, Darius sent a message to the Scythian king," Bahram continued. "Why do you keep running? he asked. "Either submit to my rule and acknowledge me as your master, or stand and fight like men." The Scythian king sent back a reply that has become famous. He sent Darius a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. No words, just these gifts. The audience looked puzzled. One of the merchants spoke up. What did it mean? Darius' advisors debated this, Bahram said with a slight smile. Darius himself interpreted it as a sign of submission. The Scythians are offering us their land, he said. The bird represents the sky, the mouse the earth, the frog the waters, and the arrows they lay down their weapons. But one of his advisors, a wise man named Gobryas, disagreed. No, he said, the message means this. Unless you Persians can fly like birds, or burrow like mice, or hide in the water like frogs, these arrows will kill you. It was not submission, but a threat. Gobryas was right, Bahram said soberly. The Scythians had no intention of submitting. Darius finally realized he could not win this war. He could not force an enemy to fight who refused to fight. He could not conquer empty grasslands. Winter was approaching. His supplies were running low. His army was exhausted. Reluctantly, he ordered a retreat back to the Danube. The retreat was nearly a disaster, Bahram explained. The Scythians harassed the Persian army every step of the way. That's the end of our story for today. We'll continue in the next episode. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.